Welcome back, Pontiac High School students. This is part two of our foreign policy overview. We're going to pick things up with World War II and go pretty deep into the Cold War in this lesson. It'll be another long one, but we'll be covering a lot of very interesting ground. Let's begin with World War II. American isolationism had ended permanently when we became involved in World War II. We gave up the idea that we could ignore the rest of the world at this point. This really struck home in 1941 when the U.S. was attacked at Pearl Harbor. This had been an idea that if we just stayed out of everybody else's business, they would stay out of our business, Americans would be safe and secure. And that was proven to be not true when the Japanese Empire attacked us, even though we weren't directly involved in that war. So the United States at that point just realized that we could not avoid this big world conflict. So we do join with the Allied forces of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and China to be one of those five great Allied powers. Now, after 6 years of fighting, 4 years for the US, we weren't in the first 2 years, the Allies do defeat the Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy, as well as their minor allies. Now, while the US and Britain played the largest role in defeating Italy and freeing France, the Soviet Union really does the bulk of the work against the Germans, who were the strongest of the the Axis powers. Germany was really a mighty military machine, but the Soviet Union was simply so big that the Germans could not take them down. And eventually the Soviet Union turned things around and defeats Hitler and defeats Nazi Germany. Against the Japanese, the U.S. really takes the lead against the Japanese. There is a little bit of help that comes in from our other allies, but mostly that was a U.S.-Japanese war. So, two new principles come out of this war. The first one recognizes, well, we'll get to it. Isolationism had been maintained because people believed it kept America safe, right? We thought that if we were isolationists, we'd be safe. Then Pearl Harbor, World War II, American policy changes from isolationism to interventionism, internationalism. The idea that we do need to get involved with other nations. We do need to form partnerships, and we do need to make sure that the world is safe. And sometimes that means going to war. The goal always remains the same. We want to keep America secure. We want to protect American interests. But we do this now by getting involved. So one of those two new principles is something called collective security. This was the first big idea coming out of World War II. This was a strategy that would protect the United States and has protected the United States. And we did this partially by creating the United Nations. The idea behind the UN is that countries who have disputes with each other can settle them in a peaceful way. They can bring the matter to the United Nations, and the United Nations can help them negotiate a peaceful settlement to that conflict. The UN would have power to maintain world peace. This was the idea. In reality, the UN's military power is fairly weak, and they do have to rely on US military power in order for that aspect of it to work. Out of World War II and out of some weakness of the UN, the United States, with its military, and the Soviet Union, the USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republics, begin to struggle for influence, begin to push each other around, begin to argue that our philosophy or their philosophy is the best. So the world starts to divide up into two camps. We get the NATO nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union and their allies. And we start to prepare for a potential war, potentially for World War III. This is how the world looked like once we carved it up. The dark blue are NATO members during the Cold War. If any NATO member was attacked by any nation, all NATO members go to war. So if Turkey was attacked by Syria, these two nations down here, all NATO nations would declare war on Syria. Likewise, if Poland was attacked, all Warsaw Pact nations would declare war on whoever had attacked Poland. That's how these worked. And it really did work to keep anybody from attacking any NATO or Warsaw Pact nation. The light blue are nations that are kind of supported by the US, and the red nations were supported or otherwise kind of allied to the Soviet Union, but not actually members. The gray nations are what are called as third world nations, and the green ones are colonies. That is, they were controlled by mostly European nations. All right, I just went over that. All right, so we had collective security as one of those ideas. The second one is this idea of deterrence. The same issue that I had last time, such a slow computer today. Apologize for the jumpiness. Deterrence. This is the second thing that was going to keep the world safe. America's second principle. The U.S. maintained their military strength. We have a big military, a huge military, the largest in the world many times over in terms of power. And we do this even in times of peace. We always are prepared for a major war. And actually, the idea is that we're always prepared to fight two major regional wars at the same time. That is the level of strength that we always try to maintain in the United States. And by being the world's strongest military all the time, the idea is that you'd have to be insane to attack us, and so that nobody would. And this has pretty much been true. Nobody does attack us except for some crazy Al-Qaeda people back in 2011. But otherwise, nobody's attacked us since the 1940s because of this idea of deterrence. And every American president has embraced this policy to one degree or another. Some would argue against having two major wars fought at the same time, thinking that one would be plenty, and they want to downsize the military a little bit. But we always do keep a big military. All right, resisting the Soviet Union. Deterrence works. It discouraged the Soviet Union from attacking us. And instead, they directed their attention toward expanding their influence over non-NATO nations. They basically left NATO alone. After World War II, the Soviets established firm control over Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And they were looking to expand even further. This expansion of control was once referred to by Winston Churchill, the leader of Europe, the leader of Great Britain during World War II, as the falling of an iron curtain. The idea that communism is expanding under the Soviet Union, and everywhere it goes, it's impossible to get through. It's impossible to get to the other side. It is an iron curtain. The United States responds to this in 1947 through the Truman Doctrine. And this says that the United States would support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by outside pressures. So basically, if a nation is being faced down by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is trying to increase their influence or overthrow that government, that the United States will defend that nation. The U.S. would support countries that were resisting the United States and would stop the spread of communism. That was Truman's idea. Another thing that happened in the 1940s, 1948, we had the Berlin Blockade. The Soviet Union tried to force the U.S. to abandon Berlin to Soviet control. See, after World War II, the United States and the Allies had divided up Germany into zones of occupation. We had the American section, the French section, the British section, and the Soviet section. And the capital city, the biggest, wealthiest city, fell within the Soviet section. But they had further divided this city into East and West Berlin, where West Berlin was actually still governed by the United States. So West Berlin was under American authority, was a part of West Germany, even though it was in East Germany. But in 1948, the Soviet Union tried to end that by cutting off supplies. They surrounded the city, wouldn't let anybody in. So the United States responds with the Berlin airlift. Basically, we flew planes into West Berlin to keep the city supplied and alive. We did this for about a year and a half before the Soviets realized that this policy wasn't working, and they allowed trade and they allowed movement into West Berlin again. The Cuban Missile Crisis was another conflict. 1959, Fidel Castro was a communist, gained control of the nation of Cuba. You'll remember from the last lesson we had fought to allow Cuban independence, and in return we would get business influence. But once Cuba becomes communist, we lose all of those businesses. Fearing the U.S. invasion to overthrow him, because the U.S. does this a lot, Castro allowed Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. The warheads themselves, though, never arrived, because President Kennedy said that if those warheads were delivered and the missiles were armed, that the United States would attack. And we promised that if they weren't, we would leave Cuba alone, that we would not invade. So the Soviet Union does withdraw those missiles. This moment becomes the closest that we ever came to actually going to war with the Soviet Union. We had a lot of flirtations with direct war. This was the closest we ever came to it, but we never did go to war. The Soviet leader Khrushchev backed off, backed down, and Kennedy kind of won this debate. The Korean War. The Korean War was not a direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it was one where we were picking sides. Sometimes one side was drawn into the fighting and would do better, but the two powers never really fought against each other. Korean War was an example of where the United States does get directly involved. The United States does directly fight in this war. The Soviet Union does not. They supply the enemies of the United States. In the Korean War, the United States fights North Korea, and we later do have to fight against China as well. We don't win this war. This war gets marked down as a draw. And in fact, even today, North Korea and South Korea are still divided. Neither side has won this war. This war is not officially ended. They've simply been in a 60-year ceasefire that occasionally shots are fired again. But those two nations are still technically at war with each other and still do struggle with each other quite a bit, especially in modern times. The war in Vietnam is a very well-known Cold War war. The U.S. here, again, gets directly involved. And we're fighting against Soviet-backed fighters in Vietnam. Again, the Soviets are supporting them, supplying them, but not actually involved in the fight. This happens when communist North Vietnamese want to reunite Vietnam. They want Vietnam to become one nation once again. See, they had been one nation, then they divided into North and South. And the North was communist. The South was ruled by a dictator. And he wasn't a very nice guy. So the North wants to go down to the South, kick out this guy, DM, who's not a very nice leader, and reunite the nation. When the North invaded the South, this was seen as a spread of communism. This is Truman Doctrine stuff. So the United States goes into South Vietnam. We fight to keep this not nice dictator in charge, and we're involved down there for 12 years. And for 12 years, we try to stop the communists from taking over. The problem is the South really didn't like their leader, and they really did like the leader of the North, a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh. And so after 12 years, we kind of realized that we're fighting for people who mostly did not want us to fight for them. We withdraw. North Vietnam wins this war. They do reunite the country. Vietnam does become a communist nation. And this goes down as the first war that the United States ever lost. We had a couple of draws in the past, but the Vietnam War, we lost this one. It was a clear loss in our column. And it was quite a blow during the Cold War. All right, so that gets us through World War II into kind of the heart of the late Cold War. Hope you learned something today. I know this was a long one. Got one more long one coming up. I'll see you next time. Farewell.